has been heavily.
Cool. Yeah, so thanks very much for having me. I'm Sam Green. I'm the freshwater ecologist at WildFish, and I mainly support the SmartRivers invertebrate monitoring project citizen science scheme that I'll talk about a bit later. If you don't know who we are, WildFish is a freshwater conservation charity. We were previously salmon and trout conservation, and much of our historical work focused on salmonids and working closely with fishing clubs and river keepers on some of our most iconic rivers. And our roots do really run deep in this sector. We're an evidence-led charity, and we use the law to address the causes, not the symptoms, of the challenges facing our freshwater habitats. And the keystone to all of this is the fact that we are completely unaligned and accept no government money. It's about wild fish first, not politics. Our overarching aim as a charity is to reverse the decline of freshwater fish populations and their habitats, and our work portfolio reflects this. One of our key work streams is campaigning to end open net salmon farming up in Scotland, but we do work internationally with partners on this, and part of that is the Off the Table campaign, persuading chefs and others in the hospitality sector to stop serving farm salmon. And if you're interested in that, I'd really recommend going to our website to learn more about the Off the Table team and the work they're doing. The second work stream, which is relevant to today's presentation, is about water action. Fish and other freshwater wildlife depend on clean water and plenty of it, but that's not always the case in the UK's rivers and lakes. And so this work stream, we look at fighting water company reliance on already stressed rivers with abstraction for water supply, ensuring the law on sewage is enforced now, not in the distant future. And most importantly, particularly for me and the SmartRivers program that I work with, is our comprehensive independent monitoring program, because it's essential that we have this, we collect this data to really understand what's going on, and that can drive action on a local and a national scale. And that's where SmartRivers comes in. And that's what I'll be speaking about a bit today. I'm sure I don't need to speak to any of you about the multiple threats that our rivers are facing, be it physical modifications, runoff from urban or agricultural settings, point pollution sources like sewage treatment works, over-extraction, invasive species, and behind this all is climate change, posing numerous threats to our freshwater habitats. And, you know, we're at a time when, I'm sure you've heard the numbers, that just 14% of rivers are in good ecological health, and none of them met a good chemical condition. And against this backdrop of sorry state of affairs, the regulators responsible for the protection of our rivers have had their budgets repeatedly slashed over the decades. And what this means is that there are less people on the ground collecting data and taking samples, monitoring how our rivers are coping. And this is where we believe citizen science can really come in to fill the monitoring gap left by our underfunded regulators. So SmartRivers is WildFish's citizen science invertebrate monitoring scheme. And what this is local groups, passionate local advocates who care about their rivers, form hubs and come to us asking to be part of the SmartRivers program, and they form a local hub where they're the experts on the ground, and we help support them monitor the rivers where it's most important to them. And this is done through some professional benchmark surveys to monitor to get a baseline of biodiversity and water quality. And then there's 2 days of training where we train our volunteers to take a kick sample and preserve the samples, and then on the second day how to identify the invertebrates they find. And a key thing to this is that from the benchmark surveys we generate an expected species list. So we're not teaching our volunteers to identify every invertebrate in the freshwater invertebrate in the UK. We train them to identify the species that we find in their rivers, and we can expand that list as more species come up. And all of this data goes on our open access database, which is available online. And if anyone wants to access this data across the country, please do email smartrivers@wildfish.org and we can arrange access for you. And so what comes out of SmartRivers are 2 things. Firstly, there's water quality stress scores, and these are calculated from the composition of the invertebrates that we find in your sample. And these metrics we use are all peer reviewed, and they're developed in the industry by other parties, not by WildFish. And these measure a variety of things like chemical pollution, fine sediment, stress, organic enrichment, flow levels, and phosphorus impacts, among a variety of other metrics. And the reason we include so many metrics is simple. As talked about in the previous slide, there's a lot of threats facing freshwater habitats. And by covering these metrics in our program, we can really identify problems on a local level, as well as looking at more broadly at national trends. And the second thing that's produced are invertebrate diversity and abundance records. So to really get an idea of the biodiversity we're finding in our rivers. And it's worth noting that while SmartRivers is a citizen science scheme, which volunteers are key for, there's a number of pathways through which we process our data. And this can be that volunteers collect the samples and do the identification themselves, or quite a few of our hubs choose to collect the samples with volunteers, and they send off the samples to professional entomologists for the identification to reduce noise in the data. But particularly for Windermere, it's worth noting that all of the surveys and identification has been conducted by an expert entomologist with over 40 years of experience in the field. Just briefly to talk about the importance of invertebrates as indicators. The invertebrates that live in our rivers are quite particular about the water quality that they need to thrive, and because they have different tolerances to pollution. So you have some species that are very, very tolerant to disturbance, and some species that are highly, highly sensitive. And these these species that are highly sensitive, traditionally some of the groups are things like mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies, which are thought of as very sensitive to pollution. And so the more of these you're finding in these samples, or some declines that you're finding in these samples, can be really indicative of pressures facing a particular water body. And we believe that invertebrates give a much more representative picture of long-term water quality compared to, say, on-the-spot water samples, because these invertebrates live in the water courses for their lives, and this could be, weeks, months, or years, depending on the life cycle. And so when there's a pollution event, you can see the kind of echoes of this event in the community for weeks and months to come. Whereas if you're taking a water sample, you might need to be in the right place at the right time. And so one of the really key points about SmartRivers and what we try and do is to get to the species level as much as possible to get a true assessment of the state of freshwater invertebrate populations. And this is really important because more traditional metrics, such as the Biological Monitoring Working Party, focus on family level monitoring, and what we feel is that this really risks missing the detail of what's going on. You wouldn't conduct a survey on the African savanna at family level and expect to know what species of big cats you're finding. And so with this example here is the British mayflies, and you've got 9 families, and within those families there's 53 species, and each of these species have different tolerances to pollution, like I mentioned. So if you monitor at the family level, you're going to miss the fine detail of what's really going on at the species level. So that's what we try to achieve with SmartRivers. So yeah, we've got 121 rivers to date, and that's including some of the rivers that are joining us in autumn this year. And that amounts to over 5,000 hours of volunteer training. And there are 34 organisations that have signed up to host hubs with us. And these are people like Rivers Trusts and Wildlife Trusts. And so we're active across the UK. And our ambition is that all rivers should be smart rivers. So if there's a gap on this map and you care about water quality in your area and you're interested in starting up a hub, please do reach out and get in touch, and we can try and see what we can do. So on to Windermere. I'll start by saying that I'm personally not an expert on Windermere. One of the powers of SmartRivers is that we work closely with our local partners, in this case, Matt and Save Windermere, who are the passionate local activists who really have their finger on the pulse of what's going on the ground or under the water, so to speak. So I would really recommend visiting their webpage after WildFish's webpage, of course, so you can see the great work they've got going on. So yeah, Windermere is England's largest naturally formed lake. It's a World Heritage Site, an area of outstanding natural beauty, and it's hugely important to the local economy, attracting millions of visitors each year. And it's a catchment of huge ecological importance as well for species such as Atlantic salmon and Arctic char and freshwater pearl mussels and many, many more. And it's a naturally nutrient poor system, and water in the basins move very slowly. And so pollution inputs can linger and build up in the sediments. And so it's hugely sensitive to disturbance from us and our inputs. And so, and a key area of concern with regards to Windermere's water quality is phosphorus, where excessive levels are a factor in causing huge algal blooms that we're seeing more of. I won't touch too much on it because I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about that in Richard's talk later. But these algal blooms can cause, a wide array of issues for wildlife and people. An Environment Agency modelling has shown that over half the phosphorus in Windermere comes from sewage, both treated and untreated. And as the water company, United Utilities is going to be the single biggest contributor of phosphorus in the catchment. But as well as phosphorus, it's worth noting that this sewage has a variety of other nasties in it that degrade the ecological health of freshwater habitats. And this could be things like fine sediment smothering the gills or eggs of a variety of aquatic life, or the huge number of chemicals that we're increasingly finding as a problem coming out of our wastewater treatment that they were never designed to deal with, and they can cause real fundamental changes to the physiology and behavior of wildlife, as well as mortality at high concentrations. And so this led to the kind of sewage, both treated and untreated, poses arguably one of the greatest threats to Windermere's water quality and its wildlife. And this is what led to Save Windermere and Matt approaching us to form a SmartRivers hub. So we formed the hub in 2023. There were some surveys conducted in 2022, but the main hub was founded in 2023. And this consists of 5 rivers and 20 monitoring sites. And it's worth noting that the aims of the hub are concerns about United Utilities infrastructure on the health of these waters. And our sample sites are designed to reflect this. It's a standard methodology of upstream and downstream of a point pollution source to really identify pressures and impacts on a local scale in the system. We published a report with Save Windermere last year, and that's available online. This talk is a brief talk, so I'm not going to be able to go into full detail of everything with each river. This is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'd recommend going to our website and reading that report to find out more information. So the first river I'm going to touch on today is the Rothay, and this flows through the town of Ambleside, which is a real visitor hotspot in Windermere. And just a point to mention here with the map that Grasmere here, the 3 sites, furthest upstream sites, are new this year. We started surveying in spring 2024, so there's no data being presented here about that. Watch this space later on. But the 4 downstream sites, we have a site upstream of the sewage treatment works. We have a site downstream of the combined sewer overflow, but still upstream of the works. And then we have 2 sites downstream of the works. And so from our first year of surveying, one of the things we're concerned about is seeing an increasing sediment pressure as we move downstream. And if you look at these graphs just to explain what's going on here a bit, black is spring surveys, pink is autumn. I should have mentioned earlier that SmartRivers we sample in the spring and autumn, and this is to get to capture the ecological detail at different times of the year. And on this graph, you can see on the left-hand side, there's a kind of traffic light system. Green is good, red is bad. Intuitive. And when we get into this orange zone in the middle is when we start to be really concerned. And particularly in the autumn surveys, we're starting to see the values, we're getting really close to that kind of like danger zone, so to speak. And the other thing that really jumped out at us about the Rothay was the impacts on the river fly populations. And so those are the mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies that I mentioned earlier. The species traditionally thought of as pollution sensitive. And so you can see here on the graphs the drop as you move downstream, particularly downstream the combined sewer overflow. And what this amounted to is an average of 64% decline in population numbers below this input. And it's again worth noting that when our professional benchmarkers went out collecting these surveys, they documented that algae at the downstream sites, particularly at sites 3 and 4, that algae coated large areas of the riverbed. And in the samples themselves, the mollusks that we collected, the algae was blanketing their shells. Next up is Cunsey Beck, which is a site where areas are designated sites of special scientific interest. And particularly downstream of the works, we're finding real problems in the habitat, and this with things like sewage fungus can be found coating the riverbed. And this is the site that in 2022 there was a big fish kill that you can read a lot about online and through Matt's work. And again, we have sites up and downstream of the works here. And yeah, so with Kanzi, what really jumped out at us is we're finding really strong signals, both in the fine sediment pressure and the phosphorus stress immediately downstream of the sewage bed. So you can see on these graphs the big drop off. And then at site 4, you can see what we consider a partial recovery. And if we go back to the map, you can see that site 4 is much further downstream than the other sites. And one of the reasons is that we needed to find representative habitat sites. But it does also show the kind of recovery going on further down and the real local impact we're seeing downstream of the works. And in our data, we're also seeing indications of downstream organic enrichment in something called the saprobic index, which graphs aren't shown here. And again, we're seeing big declines in the populations of river flies downstream of the works compared to appropriate upstream habitat. So here the value is site 1 and site 3 are glide habitat. So those are the comparisons we're making to do with the invertebrate numbers. Next up is Wilfin Beck, which I've had the pleasure of going to with Matt. It's a lovely little beck, really interesting population of brown trout isolated up there. But nonetheless, this tiny beck is impacted by the water quality in the catchment. And we've had ongoing presence of sewage fungus downstream of the works. And here we have a site upstream of the works and then 2 downstream sites, although I need to mention that last year, due to logistical reasons, we couldn't survey site 3, but that's been added back in for our 2024 surveys. And Wilfin Beck is a bit more challenging to interpret because of the autumn survey. Initially, when we spoke to Matt, there was some surveying work done in 2022 that I mentioned, and this was where we found 61% fewer invertebrate species below the works. And then in the 2023 surveys that we conducted, I'm showing here, we're continuing to see indications of increasing organic and chemical stress downstream of the works. Autumn is really challenging here because the sample was so poor. So what you can see on the right-hand side here are the invertebrate abundance in a bar graph, and all the colours mean it's the SmartRivers categories of how we separate the invertebrates when we're identifying them. And you can see in spring, there's the drop-off in abundance between site 1 and site 2. But in autumn, there's this huge drop-off, which was where only 2 leaches were found at the downstream site. And in this sample, there was a strong smell of sewage and lots of sewage fungus. The challenge here is that our water quality metrics are calculated from the invertebrate community. And so here, the invertebrate community is 2 leaches. And so things like our chemical pressure score SPEAR is unable to calculate a value based on that. And organic loads still, that value displayed on the graph is based on just those 2 leaches. But we're fairly confident about these impacts we're seeing, as in the 2022 data, we found a comparative pattern. And in the spring 2024 data so far, we're continuing to see these impacts. So there's clearly a big problem downstream of the works here. Finally, the Breve is the river I'm talking about today, and we have 4 sites here. We have a site upstream and downstream of the Elterwater pumping station that discharges into Great Langdale Beck. And then this flows into Elterwater, site of special scientific interest. And then downstream of this is Langdale Wastewater Treatment Works, which discharges into the Breve, and we have a site up and downstream of this. And so what jumped out at us from the surveys last year is that we're beginning to see strong signals of chemical impacts at the downstream sites that we need to keep an eye on. And again, we're seeing these declines in river fly species richness and abundance as you move downstream. Although, of course, Elterwater sits between these sites, so it's one of the areas that's going to be really beneficial as we continue to survey and collect more data to get a much clearer picture of what's going on in this waterway. So in summary, as I'm coming up to time, every river we surveyed in the Windermere catchment in 2023 indicated ecological stress that appears to be associated with United Utilities assets. And in particular, the things we're seeing is that the number of pollution-sensitive river flies, so mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies, downstream of the works are particularly impacted. So we're seeing strong declines in those communities. And so these results are highly concerning. We're at the beginning of our journey here, one full year of surveying, and it's something we would continue to monitor to build up a long-term data set. And so in the future, we're going to continue to expand our efforts here to capture more data. And as I mentioned earlier, Grasmere was added in spring 2024. And as I was just talking about, we're going to continue to monitor our sites to build up long-term data sets to really be able to identify patterns and trends in water quality and biodiversity in the catchment. And although I'm slightly over, Kieran, I will just a shameless plug. One of the ways we identify our invertebrates in SmartRivers is through these incredible macro images captured by Cyril Bennett. And later this week, we're going to be launching the library of all these images, open access on WildFish's website. So keep an eye on the social media channels for an announcement of that later on the week. But yeah, thank you very much for listening.